of the 2021 Online Student Development Conference. I'm the chair of the Southern African Archaeological Student Council. I'm Mariette Harkoon. With me today are two of my fellow members of council, Mpumi Maringa and Kalita Shadrack. And with us today, our very special guest all the way from Oxford is Ruby Ann Beran. But let me not steal any of Mpumi's thunder, because Ruby is her lecturer to introduce for today. So take it away, Mpumi.
Thank you so much, Mariette. Okay, so Ms. Ruby Ann Beran is a South African archaeologist specializing in optically stimulated luminescence dating. She has obtained her BSc in Geography and Archaeology and her honors degree in archaeology at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa. She has worked as a tour guide and an intern at the Erosion Center Museum, and she was a lab assistant in the OSL lab in the Geoscience department at the same university. She has obtained her master's in archaeological science at the University of Oxford, and she is currently pursuing her PhD at the same university while holding the position as a junior dean at St. John's College at Oxford. All right, so her presentation is titled Telling Time: How Luminescence Methodologies Are Used to Understand the Recent Southern African Past, a Bakoni case study. Thank you, Ruby. You may start your presentation.
Great. Thanks, Pums. So can you see? Oh, I've skipped the end. Let's start there. Great. Can you see my screen? I'm going to take that as a yes.
Yep, all good.
Cool. So telling time, how luminescence methodologies are used to understand the recent Southern African past, the Bakoni case study. So this paper or this presentation is heavily based on a previous presentation I gave at the ASAPA conference 2 years ago. It is based on the work I did from my honors with Dr. Mary Evans and Professor Alex Kuman. And it's really through this collaboration that we hope to promote luminescence dating and trying to understand absolute time in the recent Southern African past. So today we're going to be looking at Bakoni, the results of which have just been published earlier this week in JIS reports. And if you're interested in this talk or interested in the methodologies, you're welcome to go through that paper or contact me directly for more questions. And we're going to be exploring the aim of Erosional. So why are we using luminescence dating at Bakoni? How is that going to help us understand time? Where is the site that we're actually talking about? The methods available for dating, luminescence dating as an introduction. So just get your basic understanding of actually how is the science working, and our sampling and results, and the really exciting conclusions we received from the study. So our aim was to provide the first absolute dates to Bakoni phase 1 settlements. So very simply put, we're trying to use pottery and sediment samples from 2 homesteads in a southern village in Bakoni to understand when each site was constructed. And we want to do this because Bakoni is a really remarkable stone-walled and terraced region in South Africa. It is the southernmost terraced farming, stone terraced wall farming site in the country and Africa as a whole. It is a really unique form of urban farming that hasn't really survived to the contemporary present. And we're hoping through dating artifacts and sediments, we can constrain construction and utilization so that we understand both when people built these homesteads and lived in them and what their lives maybe were a little bit like during habitation. So where is this? So we're looking in the northeast of Southern Africa, right over here, and it crosses the Mpumalanga-Limpopo boundary, but we're actually going to be looking at the southernmost region of Bakoni, which is in Mpumalanga itself. So Bakoni is built along a watershed system, and it is subdivided into 4 phases through a Harris matrix and through oral history. So phase 1 is in the southern area, and that's what we're looking at today. And the southern area is a part called Komati Gorge Village, and this is the oldest. We don't know when this was first built until now. We've got phase 2 in the 17th and 18th century, so petty oral histories, and recorded by missionaries in the 1800s, and anthropology masters by Prince Lou in the 1930s talk about the capital cities in Bakoni in the 17th and 18th century. And this was really the height of Bakoni's prowess. It was when people were living in very structured, kilometers long cities and towns. And it was a very dynamic system. In the 18th and 19th century, Bakoni began to collapse, and people began to disperse and spread out to more remote areas. This was owing to, in a large part, to different political pressures and conflicts happening in the region at the time. The polity never really regroups itself. So this collective and the society doesn't really ever manage to regroup and reoccupy and rebuild after the 19th century. And so that's mid-19th century to the present is sort of looking at the present day ruins and what is left with some oral histories. But we really want to know, when did this start? And maybe later we could infer, how did this start, from looking at the when. So we're looking at the southern area, just a little bit north of Carolina, Komati Gorge, Village 1. These are the two homesteads in the village that we're looking at. So KG 80 and KG 81. So while we don't have any absolute dates for phase 1, we do have a Harris matrix of the Komati Gorge village. And so we know that KG 80, which is this more southern homestead, is older than KG 81. And this is because KG 81 used some of the stones, we can see where they've been removed from KG 80 to build their new homestead, but also they possibly used the ruins and the terraces of KG 80 to farm. So the land use, this old household was reused in a new format to supplement the new household. So we wanted to, though, understand a little bit better about the construction phases and when phase 1 occurs, as I was saying. So broadly speaking, dating has two categories, and some of you should remember this if you've done revenue and barn in your first term at WITS, but you've got relative dating and absolute dating. So relative dating is when you can tell X happened before Y, because Y is on top of X. Or someone tells a story that so-and-so lived here, and then so-and-so lived here, and then this thing happened. So you can construct an order of events, but you can't tell when that event happened. So this is very useful. It's very nice. We get a little bit of personal histories in it sometimes, and it's even constructs our Harris matrices. But when we look at ethnography, which is based on the oral history, so these stories that tell the histories, we can't use it for phase 1 because we don't have anything. No one recorded it, and by the time people were recording these stories, no one remembered when the settlement began. So our second technique, which is possibly the oldest absolute dating technique, it's also a relative technique. It sort of hinges on this X happened before Y, but also we know X is in this year, is dendrochronology, and that is counting tree rings. And so if you count the tree rings in a bark of wood, you should be able to match that to a record, and that will tell you which year, and it can be very, very precise, almost to the year that piece of wood was laid down. However, we don't have any tree survival in this area, or old tree survival. Our next methodology that we're looking at is possibly one of the most popularized forms of dating in archaeology, and that's radiocarbon. This is an absolute dating method. It is only really applicable before 1950. It isn't ideal from the mid-1800s because of the Industrial Revolution, starts changing the carbon cycle, affecting the carbon cycle, as well as a carbon plateau in the atmosphere. It's a lot of complicated reasons why radiocarbon dating isn't that ideal for the very recent past. And it relies on the decay of the radioactive isotope of carbon. So carbon is in everything living, and when living things die, they stop uptaking new carbon, and that means their radioactive component of carbon starts to decrease, and we measure that decrease, and that tells us the time. However, that relies on having dead things, things that have died. Okay, Bakoni has poor organic preservation, as we know from the dendrochronology section. So unfortunately, it's not great. There are, however, new techniques in radiocarbon dating that may become applicable in the future, like dating the carbon remains that have been trapped in parts or on parts, and in the lipids or in the grass in it. So maybe radiocarbon dating is something that we could use in the future, but right now it's a little bit touch and go. Our last technique that we're going to be looking at, and which is what we apply, is luminescence dating. So luminescence dating, like radiocarbon dating, is absolute dating. So it gives you a date per X. So it gives you a date relative to when you measure it. So it's 200 years ago, 250 years ago from the year you measure it. And it relies on quartz and feldspar grains that have been exposed to light or heat. So how does this work? So we've got quartz and feldspar grains in Bakoni. It's some of the most abundant minerals in the world, and so it's really good. So how does this work? Well, when quartz and feldspar are exposed to light or heat and get transported and then buried, they undergo a process called bleaching. So when they're exposed to light or heat, they are bleached. So if you imagine a quartz or feldspar grain as a battery, it has 100% charge. When it's exposed to light or heat, it goes to 0% charge. So if this is your cell phone, you're going from 100% to 0% with the exposure to the sunlight. When it's buried, it has the ability to use the surrounding radiation to recharge itself. So this recharge is really important because it recharges at different rates. So how some newer models of cell phones can get to 50% in 20 minutes, if you plug it in, while older models would take 50% in 3 hours. The rate at which it recharges itself is the same. So the soil has different recharge rates, and we need to measure that. So what we do is we measure the percentage that it has recharged, and we call that the equivalent dose, and we divide it by the environmental dose rate. So that newer charger versus the older charger, so a fast charger versus a slow charger, what is the dose rate? How quickly does it accumulate charge? And that gives us our age. So whether it would be in our cell phone analogy, 20 minutes versus 3 hours, or in the case of this, it's 300 years ago versus 20,000 years ago. So as I said, we need to be what decharges our quartz grains is the sun. So when we extract soil or sediment, we need to be really, really careful not to re-expose it to the sunshine. So we do this by banging in these steel tubes or really hard, non-transparent plastic tubes into the sediment and removing them carefully, so making sure the middle bit isn't ever exposed to the sun. You can see here that we've got an occupation layer, and we've taken sediment samples from above and below the occupation level. So BKN1 and BKN3, these are our lab numbers, are above the occupation level, and BKN4 and BKN2 are below the occupation levels. We've also taken an additional sample, BKN5, which we've taken below a terrace. So this is an agricultural terrace, was what people are using to farm. And so we were trying to understand the minimum age for that rock above there being deposited. So once we take the samples out of the field, so these are sediment or pottery samples. Pottery samples, we don't need to take in as dark light conditions when we extract them, but we do need to, like the sediment samples, remove the outer layers that were exposed to the sun, measure the water content, remove any organic remains, remove any carbonates, isolate the quartz and feldspar grains, and then in the case of optically stimulated luminescence, which is the luminescence methodology we're applying at Bakoni, remove the feldspar because that can confuse the signal. We're then going to run several types of tests, and the one is to test what temperature to measure the dose at, and the other one is to measure the dose of the sample, so the equivalent dose. The dose rate, the rate at which it accumulates charge, is done often in a different lab, and for this project was done out of our SADI Temper labs in Cape Town. So our preheat test, this tells us at what temperature we're going to measure it at, and you can just see here one pottery and one sediment sample, and we both of for most of our samples we chose a higher temperature because we could obtain a more accurate answer at these higher temperatures. And then we get our equivalent dose. So this is the measurement of how much charge does our quartz grain have. And each of these dots represents a different measurement on our aliquot. So a small group of quartz grains that we've put in specialized equipment. So you can see the spread here. It's relatively contained in this BKN1. It's not very spread out, which means we can calculate the central age. So almost like an average, a type of average of all these different aliquots, all these different measurements together. If we were to have a huge diverse sample, so if these dots were spread out really, really far, we could then calculate something called the minimum age, which I'll show you in a moment. And the minimum age informs us on what's the most recent possible date that the sample can be, as opposed to what is the most likely date that the sample can be. And that's if the over dispersion, the spread of these dots are too big to get an accurate average. So these are our results. So we've got two clusters of results. We've got ceramics and sediment. And we can see the ceramic ages are split into two, are approximately younger, more recent than our sediment ages. So these ceramic ages, you can see the KG80, so BKP1 and BKP3 tend to be older than the KG81, which is what we would expect. And we can see then on our sediment ages, we have got the BKN1 and BKN3, which were above the occupation layer, and BK are more recent than BKN4, which is below the occupation layer. Because BKN4 had such a wide over dispersion, it was so scattered, we also calculated the youngest possible age it could be. Unfortunately, we didn't have enough sediment to test BKN2, and so BKN4 is impaired like BKN1 and BKN3. BKN5, which was, if you remember to those pictures, you could see Anshi below the terrace. It's the one far below the terrace. We've got our oldest sample, which is what we expect. It's the deepest sample. It's also the one from before people arrived. So we know that the hill was forming at some point between 1400 BCE and 833 CE. So it was forming over this really long natural period. And it was very scattered, and that scattering tells us probably natural forces that developed it, as opposed to these more less spread out ages, which would have been all exposed to sunlight at once because humans were toiling the soil. So people were occupied KG80 at some point, or built KG80 after 1165 CE, or at the most recent possible date at 1534 CE. There were people who had laid down a floor or an occupation layer. So that is, the occupation layer is above these ages. These little numbers here are the errors. So we can see we've got rather large margins of errors. And then that layer, that floor, was abandoned at some point in the late 15th century, most likely, because these two dates are from above the occupation layer. So the occupation layer was already buried. So this household possibly doesn't have a very long lifespan. We then have these pottery samples, and the pottery samples are telling us about the people who dropped broken pots or were reutilizing KG80, in this case, these two samples, and using KG81, which we get from these younger samples. And what we can see is people return to Komati Gorge village after a rather significant break. We don't know why. Maybe it was because of the collapse in the 18th century. We've got these dates which are surprisingly late. So people are living and coming back and reusing their ancestral land or their someone else's household, which has been abandoned, to build their own homes and farm. So are these ages accurate? Well, we've got some rather large margins of errors for some of them. And we can see the higher up, this is age, and this is the present on our left, is the present, in the past on our right. We can see both for the sediment and the pottery samples, the depth that they were found at versus the age, and they're actually pretty good. So there's nothing that really younger above. So it works with the stratigraphy, which is important with luminescence dating to do a check. Though we do see there is quite a diversity of ages here with the pottery samples. And so people were dropping their pots over a rather significant period of time. So I've just thrown a whole bunch of numbers at you and a whole bunch of household numbers. So what does this actually mean? Well, KG 80 was occupied probably from 1515 CE to around 1597. And then it was reused by a later family or group of people from 1708 to 1765. So it had this rather long occupation, abandonment, and reuse period. It was constantly being investigated. KG 81 was then utilized around the time that we can see the reuse of KG 80. And it was abandoned fairly late. So we've got a rather large margin of error here, but we know by the mid-1800s or early 1900s that KG 81 was abandoned. And this would coincide with the final fall of Bakoni. By using both pottery and sediment samples, we managed to get a more holistic view of the occupation. Very often, people will do only one dating technique or only on one type of sample. So just sediment or just pottery or just radiocarbon. But the more different types of ages we get, the more we can refine the stories of the people who are living there, get a little bit of insight into their lives, like not just when you built a household, but when did you live there? Did someone else come after you? This is important stories that we can get within Southern Africa that often we are missing from the written and historical record. These are the first scientific dates for Komati Gorge Village 1 and Bakoni, and it establishes the continued potential of the technique in understanding the habitation within Bakoni. This research has now subsequently been further developed in the WITS labs and the WITS archaeology department to better understand the full sequence at this village, and hopefully in the future to understand the habitation and patterns in other parts of Bakoni. So I'd like to thank everyone for their time and for listening and for inviting me for today. And if you have any questions, please feel free to get in touch.
All right, thank you so much, Ruby. That was a very informative presentation on OSL dating of the homestead in Bakoni. So I'm going to open the question and answer session now. Is there anybody who would like to ask a question? Mariette or Kalita first?
Mariette, go ahead.
Oh, thank you, so polite. Usually I hog the first questions, but I decided today I'm going to have manners. Ruby Ann, thank you so much for your presentation. And I think you kind of mentioned this as one of your points towards, you know, at your conclusion in your summary section, is just how important is it to use basically as many scientific methods you have available to you to kind of create that holistic view, you know, of archaeological sites. And, you know, it's kind of using different technologies kind of can be used for a dual validation process, you know, kind of you have a data set and you have results on that data set. And then just to get another technology applied to kind of verify those dates. So are there any other methods that you feel would be of value specifically to the Bakoni sites in terms of dating?
I think the radiocarbon dating that's going to happen in the next few years. And I know been working on it at WITS, and I know a little bit about what they've been doing with, they've been working at WITS with the, and what they've been doing a little bit at the Oxford labs is really exciting. And they might be almost non-destructive ways. I mean, OSL destroys the pot. might be a non-destructive way, so you don't have to just give your ugly pieces of sherds to date. And I think that's potential. Using luminescence in the recent past isn't common. So traditionally in Southern Africa, when luminescence dating is applied, it's applied to understand river movements and migrations or the Middle Stone Age. So you've got a radiocarbon sort of right up to the brink of 40,000 years, which is the maximum. You can pretty much use it in Southern Africa. And then you have luminescence dating taking up after then. So it hasn't really been used to its full potential, but it's when we use those two techniques together or try and understand that how they intersect, that we can prove that one, luminescence dating is actually accurate in this period, and two, radiocarbon dating is accurate in this period, because there are complications, particularly as us being in the Southern Hemisphere. So there are other methodologies. It's difficult without organic preservation. And so it's really trying to pull those organics, I think, what the radiocarbon is moving towards, pull out the organics out of things that we didn't think organics survived in, and date that. I think we're into an exciting period of trying to understand chronology. But it's really about going in with purposeful questions and understanding what your ages are telling you.
Yeah, that's of course important, not just knowing the age, but what exactly does this age tell us at the end of the day. Thanks, Ruby.
All right. So if I just may ask a couple of questions, because as you were going, I was writing some down, and you already spoke on like how big your sample size was, and what is the other one? Oh, I wanted to find out why pick KG80 and KG81? What is the significance of that?
So the benefit was that superposition, that we knew KG80 was older than KG81. Mm-hmm. So because we already had that relative dating, we could check that as long as KG80 came out as older than KG81, our dates were correct, and they did. So that's useful. And it's trying to understand that relationship about abandonment and reuse. So how long can a household be abandoned before someone feels this is a ruin now and I can use it as my garden? You know, do people, and this will only come out with more households like this, but do people feel that 10 years isn't enough? You have to wait 40 or 60 or 120 years before you can go, okay, this ruin is dead, and now I can reuse it. And this starts giving us that insight into that relationship of use and reuse.
Okay. Well, that also gives a nice perspective of things like use, reuse, and change of function of households and homesteads. It could be a good topic to discuss, or another research project to find out about, if it's possible to find out about those things. So yeah, well, I have another question, but I think I'll ask it off to Kalita. Kalita, do you have any questions?
Thank you so much for yet another wonderful presentation. And I find what you specialize in fascinating, and we've had an opportunity to work together, so that's even more exciting. I do have a question regarding the erosional rates and, potential mixing and influence of biotubation on the dose rate. I know during the process of OSL analysis, you do provide basically a rate for potential mixing. And I'm just wondering, because of the site's age being within the whole archaeological record fairly young, is there, and because of the preservation influences, was the dose rate affected by any biotubation or downward erosion of material, hence specifically sediments?
Thankfully, for most of them, we were lucky, and they were well bleached before they were buried. And so we didn't have a huge influence of biotubation in it. We did have some, and we definitely know there's some from the excavations because of ant holes and things like that. So whenever you see that, just let the lab know that you saw that. Can explain some things. So there definitely was some. but not terribly. What we saw at that BKN5, which is below the terrace, that age, that was heavily mixed. And that was from a long erosional process of deposition. And when we see that heavy mixing, we generally assume that it accumulated through natural forces over a long time, or maybe even water was involved in the transport of those grains. Probably not at Bakoni because it's on a hill, but if it's next to a riverbed. What we do find though is that the pots were really well, like bleached and really well in the size. And so that we assume the dose and the equivalent dose was really nicely contained within it because it's trapped there. And so the pots gave a really nice, relatively, apart from the one, precise ages, which helped us understand the story a little bit better.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Okay. I think I have like one more question. So Ruby, do you intend on continuing OSL dating at Bakoni?
Unfortunately, that's not going my current research. There are lots of people at FITS under Mary and Alex's fantastic supervision who will be continuing it. Emmanuel is about to submit his master's on many, many more sites, which will be really exciting. I've seen some of his ages. And so this is an ongoing project and an ongoing process. My current research is actually looking a little bit more into what these ages mean, and I'm revisiting the Middle Stone Age and early later Stone Age and creating a database and trying to understand and interpret what are these fantastic ages we've accumulated over the last 20 years mean, and how can we combine them to tell a more holistic story of Southern Africa.
Okay, cool. Mariette,
jumping quite far back in time.
It's okay. That's what archaeologists do.
I chose time so I can move around.
Yeah. Mariette, do you have a question?
No, I'm done for today.
Okay.
Yes, but just to add to that whole, actually going into and looking into what all these times that we actually get, all these days that we get, what do they mean? Because I think a lot of people kind of get stuck at the science and they get stuck at the data and they're like, okay, these are the dates. I'm like, okay, cool. What do they mean? So I'm glad that people are thinking and trying to get more holistic views of sites, and just
and I definitely want to help develop almost a translation guide so that both archaeologists and chronologists can understand each other, and rather than throwing different terminologies which have equivalence in each other, can start going, okay, now we're on the same page and we can really approach these sites in a holistic and functional way and understand what the past research has done, because we've got really fantastic past research and it's just a time take the COVID field break to evaluate the benefits of and true potential of what we've done previously.
Yeah, I think that's kind of been like a positive outcome of the pandemic, is not being able to go out in the field. And a lot of people have said, okay, well, what do we have in the labs? What previous research can I go and look at and relook at some of the data and maybe try new methods, apply new scientific methods to work that's already been done. I mean, even in the future, from here on, new technologies that develop where people in the future archaeologists are going to reanalyze our work. So, but thank you very much. If we don't have any further questions, then this is it for this lecture session. I just want to tell all the students tuning into this lecture today, please remember to go and complete the little quiz that we've got associated with this lecture, and we'd like to gauge your participation in the Student Development Conference through your activities. And then lastly, thank you so much again, Ruby Ann, for joining us today.
Thanks for inviting me.
It's
nice
a great
to see everyone again.
Yeah. All right,
Thank
everyone.
You,
Good day further. Bye.